The Scythians were an ancient Iranian people who had a very unique history and culture, and this is unfortunately misconstrued by many modern day groups, particularly Turks, who believe that the Scythians were Turkic in origin. The reality is that genetic studies do not support this theory, particularly where it concerns the Western Scythians, and this will be the focus of the video, as recently there was a study that was released on the genetic history of Scythia, particularly the Scythians of Russia and Ukraine. Unfortunately, many Turks overlook this and they particularly focus on the Eastern Scythians to claim that the Scythians were a Turkic people, but the reality is, as you will see, they were largely genetically a European population. Despite being primarily of late Bronze Age Indo-European descent, particularly Indo-Iranian descent, the Scythians are not genetically akin to the Slavs of today, as they have a very different ethnogenesis. In fact, the Scythians were also very distinct genetically from the Nordic populations of today. Thus, the Scythians were indeed a unique ancient population both genetically as well as culturally, as you will see, and what this means is that they were an Indo-Iranian tribe with little relationship with Nordic European Slavs as well as Turks, and also I have to say modern day Iranians and Central Asians. I will begin this analysis by providing a bit of historical context, and then I will transition into taking a look at the genetic study. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin my analysis. Here is a map of the Scythian kingdom at its greatest extent between 680 and 600 BCE, and you can see alongside controlling much of southern Ukraine as well as the Caucasus, the Scythians also extended into part of Anatolia as well as northwestern Iran. Thus, the Scythians did indeed have a presence in ancient Iran. The Medians and the Persians eventually pushed out the Scythians from Anatolia as well as Iran, and for this reason they were restricted to parts of the Caucasus as well as southern Ukraine and parts of the Balkans in later periods, particularly 600 BCE to the 3rd century BCE. The Bosporan kingdom actually dates to this later Scythian period, and it was primarily centered in the Crimean Peninsula as well as a part of the Caucasus, and this kingdom was an amalgamation of Hellenic as well as Scythian culture, and this will also be evident from one of the sample sets from this kingdom, which had a very mixed profile between the Scythians and the Hellenic colonists in the region. Here is a Western Scythian artifact, and you can see that the horseman has very strong Europid phenotypic features. Here is yet another Western Scythian artifact, and once again you can see that the steppe or Europid influences are very heavy here, and this will be corroborated by the genetic results. Here is the same artifact from a different angle, and once again you can see that the Europid or steppe influences are heavy, and this is because the ancient Scythians descended primarily from Indo-Europeans, particularly the Indo-Iranians. Now I'd like to get into the findings of the actual genetic study, which was titled Genetic History of Scythia, and it was published in Science Advances. Science Advances is a very reputable journal, and for those of you wanting to read the abstract, you can pause the video here and do so, as I will not do so myself. Here are the locations from which these samples were taken from, and you can see that they were all across what was historically Scythia, including parts of the Caucasus as well as the Balkans, but nonetheless again centered primarily on southern Ukraine. And here is just a timeline of all of the samples that have been sequenced dating to the Bronze Age and the Iron Ages. And here is just a principal component analysis of the clustering of the Scythian samples, and as you can see they are in between the Iranian and Caucasian populations and the European and steppe populations, and what this suggests is that despite primarily being of Indo-Iranian steppe descent, they nonetheless had ancestry deriving from a BMAC as well as indigenous Caucasian source, though there was nonetheless more indigenous Caucasian as opposed to BMAC ancestry. The admixture panel for the Scythian population suggests that they were primarily of Bronze Age European descent, which is Indo-Iranian or steppe descent. Despite this, they did have minor amounts of East Asian as well as Caucasian Iranian ancestry, and also sub-Saharan African ancestry appears, though nonetheless I think that this is likely due to some sort of conversion error and not actual sub-Saharan African ancestry. Here are the QP80M models for the Scythians featured in this study, and you can see that the majority of their ancestry is from a steppe-related source, or in some cases an Eastern Baltic source, which is very identical to the steppe-related sources. And what's interesting here is that the Scythians themselves had minimal non-European ancestry and were primarily of Indo-Iranian descent. And what this suggests is that they had very little interactions with the people of the BMAC culture, as the other groups to their west as well as to their south had more interactions with Caucasian as well as BMAC populations, which is very interesting. Thus, the Western Scythians were indeed largely an Indo-Iranian population, both genetically and culturally, and by Indo-Iranian, I am of course referring to the Proto-Indo-Iranian Sintashta, Srubnaya, and Andronovo peoples. And here is just the complete admixture panel for the Scythians as well as other populations, and you can pause the video here and take a closer look. But what's interesting is that again the Scythians are very close to Bronze Age European steppe populations and very distant from the Iron Age Hassanlu or Anatolian populations, and this suggests that they were mostly genetically a European population. Despite their significant Indo-Iranian ancestry, you can see that the majority of the Scythians were not blue-eyed, were not blonde hair, and were certainly not very pale. And this is very interesting. And what's more is that the average eye color amongst the Scythians was brown, the hair color was brown, and finally the skin color was intermediate and pale and not very pale. And what this suggests is that the Scythians were not phenotypically a Nordic population despite primarily being of Indo-Iranian genetic descent. Moving on, this is another West Eurasian PCA, and again you can see that the Scythians do not cluster directly with Europeans, though nonetheless they are fairly close to them, but rather the Scythians are in between Iranian and East Asian populations as well as European populations, and this is because they have a mixture from these populations, though nonetheless they were again mostly European with minor amounts of East Asian and very little Iranian and Caucasian ancestry. Here is the final set of charts that I will be taking a look at from the study, and you can see that these are QP80M runs, and again you can see that while the Scythians were primarily of European ancestry, they nonetheless in some cases had a bit of East Asian ancestry, which actually appears in nearly all of the Scythian samples, and also that minor amounts of Alalak or Turkey mid to late Bronze Age ancestry, which is very much closely related to ancient Iranian populations, and also BMAC or Bustan Bronze Age ancestry. Nonetheless, despite this, they did not primarily descend from these ancestries, but rather they primarily descended from steppe Indo-European populations. Thus, the Western Scythians were indeed Indo-Iranians. That ends my analysis of the study. Up next, I will be taking a look at the Scythian samples closer utilizing the Global 25 calculator. Here are the source populations that I will be using, and you can see there's a Russia late Bronze Age Srubnaya component, there's an Uzbekistan Bustan Bronze Age component, there's an early Iron Age slab grave component from Mongolia, there's a Botai Neolithic component from Kazakhstan, there's an Alalakh mid to late Bronze Age source from Turkey, there's a Greece Palace of Nestor or Mycenaean Bronze Age source, and then there's a globular amphora component from Poland, and finally there's a Sub-Saharan African Ethiopian component. And I made these components very similar to the ones featured in the study so that the results would be more clearer. Here are the Global 25 results for the averaged out Scythian sample sets. They are on average 62.7%, Srubnaya late Bronze Age 16.2%, Mycenaean from the Bronze Age 7.9%, BMAC 5.3%, Mongolia early Iron Age slab grave 3.2%, Botai early Neolithic from Kazakhstan 2.1%, globular amphora from Poland 1.9%, Alalakh mid to Bronze Age from Turkey, and 0.5% Sub-Saharan African. Thus, these results prove that while the Scythians were primarily of Srubnaya late Bronze Age descent, they nonetheless had significant ancestry from other sources, which is very interesting, and I think that these are fairly accurate results, and the only issue is the Sub-Saharan African ancestry showing up, though I just reckon that that's primarily due to damage of the samples when they were being handled. The individual samples are on average 69.2%, Srubnaya Late Bronze Age 7.8%, Mycenaean Bronze Age 5.3%, Kazakhstan Bow Tie only 5.3%, Bustan Bronze Age, though this varies from 0% to as high as 21.6%, and then also 4.8% Globular Amphora, 4.6% Mongolia Slab Grave, 2.7% Alalakh, and this is another ancient Iranian or Anatolian source, and finally 0.3% Sub-Saharan African. The study also featured an early Allen as well as a Sarmatian sample, and you can see that these two samples have much more Bustan Bronze Age ancestry, and what this suggests is that the further west or the further south, some of these populations where they had more BMAC ancestry, and this is in line with previous samples that have been sequenced, and these are on average 61.4% Srubnaya, 18.6% Bustan, 8.7% Bowtie, 7.0% Slab Grave, 3.4% Globular Amphora, and finally 0.9% Sub-Saharan African. The coverage and dates are also listed, but what's more is that the Sub-Saharan African ancestry that appears is again likely due to damage and should not be taken seriously, but the rest of the results are pretty much in line with other Sarmatian and closely related sample sets such as the Allens, but this is an early Allen, and what this means is that they have retained more of that step profile, which suggests they derive largely from the Sarmatians. In this video, I took a look at the genetic origins of the Scythians, particularly the Western Scythians, based on a recent genetic study, and what was proven is that these populations were primarily of Indo-Iranian descent and were thus distinct from both the Nordics as well as the Slavs of today. But not only this, they were also fairly divergent genetically from contemporary Iranian and Central Asian populations. It was also proven that the Scythians were not genetically Turkic or of Turkic origin, that were primarily of Indo-Iranian descent, particularly descending from the ancient late Bronze Age steppe populations, and what this suggests is that they have nothing to do with the contemporary Turks or even contemporary Central Asians who are of Turkic descent. Despite their overwhelming late Bronze Age steppe descent, the Scythians did have a bit of BMAC as well as ancient Anatolian and Iranian ancestry alongside East Asian ancestry, though nonetheless, compared to their overwhelming Indo-European or Indo-Iranian ancestry, these components were minimal. Thus, the ancient Scythians were indeed an Indo-Iranian population descending from the ancient steppe pastoralists and were not akin to contemporary European populations, and for this reason, the Slavs of today, as well as the Nordics of today or any other European population, are not their direct descendants, as they were a unique population. That is it for this video, and for those of you wondering, the historical series is well underway and I should release my video on King Xerxes very soon, but I just wanted to release this video before then, and I also wanted to say that this is probably my last work on genetics for quite some time, until and unless we get more ancient Iranian samples as well as samples that are relevant to the ethnogenesis of the ancient Iranians as well as the ancient Indo-Iranians. Thank you for watching everyone, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.